Hey folks, I'm Alex Dowd.
And I'm Katie Rife.
Last month, Netflix released Fear Street, a trilogy of teen thrillers based on the young adult novels by R.L. Stine. Arriving at a clip of once a week for 3 weeks, each installment was set in a different decade and evoked a different school of scary movie. Did the films deliver the retro goods? And how did they play as 3 parts of one big story? On today's episode, we take a closer look at the intended streaming horror event of the summer.
Welcome to Film Club.
I only smile in the dark. My only comfort is the night gone black. I'm only happy when it rains.
Okay, folks, thanks again for joining us for another episode of Film Club. And up top, I'm going to issue a small apology. We told you 2 lies last week on the show. The first lie was that what happened at the very end of the episode, obviously, where we told you that we were going to be talking about the best films of 2001. On this week's episode. We are not doing that today. We will be doing that sometime in the future, so stay tuned for that. I can't say when just yet, but that will be a topic of conversation. You get to hear Katie and I discuss our respective favorites from 2001, but not today. And the other lie that we told you last week was sort of a much more inadvertent one, I would say in some respects. We basically said sort of offhandedly that we are not going to do a full episode on Fear Street. And that's untrue because that is what we're doing today. We are, in fact, doing a full episode on Netflix's Fear Street trilogy.
The thing with the Fear Street movies is that they are, you mentioned in the intro that they were intended to be kind of a summer streaming event, and they kind of are. Articles are still coming out about this series a few weeks after it debuted. Almost a month now, right after the first one came out?
Yeah, the beginning of July, more than a month.
Yeah, and it's still kind of in the conversation, and, it's like you said, it's this big event, so I figured we go back and talk about it. To lift the curtain just a little bit without going into too much detail, we had a scheduling change at the website, which kind of shook up Film Club as well, because we kind of base what we talk about on the podcast sometimes around what's going on in this site as a whole, so that's why we're talking about Fear Street today, but I feel like there is a lot to get into with this trilogy of films, mini-series, whatever you want to call it.
It's interesting that we're talking about it as an event of the summer. I don't know how we measure that anymore, and I don't know how, particularly, Netflix is so cagey about their numbers, and we're all just supposed to sort of take their word on how well something performs or doesn't perform, even though there's never any solid numbers. And I think even if they did release numbers, what metric would we be judging those against? Because that part of the industry is so mysterious. I mean, it used to be that, like, what something did at the box office, that was a clear sign. You could see what something did opening weekend, and you could say whether or not this thing was a success or not. Where obviously we're living in a much different era now, and I know that anecdotally, Fear Street is something that people have been talking about and we're definitely talking about a lot last month. I know it's something that a lot of people I know at least watched one entry of. So it is in the air, and I do think there are probably people still catching up with it. I do wonder how much it was the phenomenon that Netflix was hoping for with it.
Right. I mean, there's really no way for us to know because, like you said, Netflix is extremely cagey about its numbers. It'll release some kind of cryptic statement every once in a while, like, oh, well, this was our best since blah, 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 but they don't tell you exactly how many numbers. And the other thing about Netflix, too, is this is anecdotal, so don't quote me on this. I'm not sure. I don't have official confirmation this is true, but I've been told that Netflix counts, if you turn something on and watch 5 minutes of it and click away, they count it as a view. You don't have to watch the whole thing for it to count as a view on Netflix.
I assume they have some way of knowing, though, how far somebody got into something, right?
Oh, yes. I'm sure they have all kinds of, metrics on that. How many times you paused it, things like that. Even, the virtual screeners that we watch sometimes for film festivals or films, there are ways for publicists to tell that kind of thing on those. So I don't see why Netflix wouldn't have that technology.
Uh-oh, better finish that movie, Katie. You're going to have a publicist coming for you.
Hey, I always do. Sometimes I pause them, but I always finish them.
I generally do. I particularly with the virtual system, I can't say there aren't at least a couple times where I bailed on a movie that I was pretty sure was not working for me in order to watch something else. I generally don't do that. I'm not much of I don't walk out of movies much, in the traditional sense or in the walkout sense. I do. There is something I do sometimes that I call the soft walkout. And it's where I'm watching something, and I think I should preface this by saying I would never write about a movie I didn't finish, ever.
Right,
Never.
of course. If you're reviewing it, you watch it paying full attention with pen and paper and all that.
Exactly.
But go ahead.
Exactly. But I will sometimes, if I'm watching something on my own time, sort of off the clock, and I'm watching it up late or something on the couch, and it's not really working for me, and then, whoops, I fall asleep, I will sometimes not return to it the next day. I'll just let it go from there, and that's what I like to call the soft walkout.
Well, as long as we're playing Screener True Confessions right now, I have a version of the soft walkout, which is when you're watching something and you're like, I'm not really into this, and you get kind of bored. Sometimes halfway through, I'll pick up my phone and start playing with my phone and just leave it on in the background. So I kind of see what happens, but I'm not. Again, I would never do that with a movie I'm reviewing. But
yeah, it's a real danger. It's a real danger, and I do feel like the pandemic, I think, has exacerbated the problem of being drawn to distractions while you're watching a movie.
Oh boy, has it ever! Oh yeah. Man, like I feel like I've necessarily gotten better at paying attention to things on my TV at home and not getting distracted just because you have to. For that whole year we weren't going to the theater, but it's hard. It's obviously in a theater, there's nothing else for you to pay attention to. So
right, yeah. I mean,
the film has your full attention.
You're a monster if you have your phone out in the theater.
Oh my God! What did you pay money for? That's our new promo. Dowd saying you're a monster if you pull your phone out. But in your
living room, all bets are off, I guess.
Well, it's kind of funny. It's a bit of a tangent, but it kind of ties into what we're talking about today, which is the Fear Street trilogy, because these movies, it's 3 movies, and each of them are almost 2 hours long, and they cram a lot of plot into every one of these installments. And so I feel like these movies, you really can't get too distracted because a lot happens, and there's just a lot crammed into these.
Yeah, for something that is very clearly riffing on the slasher movie legacy, I would say these are very, very plot driven. There are not a lot of traditional slasher movies that are this invested in the mythology and this invested in the story they're telling. It's one way that these films, I think, sort of break from the tradition that they're supposedly working in.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely. Well, I suppose when you go into like later installments in, say, the Friday the 13th series, you'll have like callbacks and Easter eggs and stuff like that. But this film, like you said, is very invested in its own mythology. There's like a long chant, sort of a rhyme that characters repeat throughout the movie, and you see written around different places. And yeah, you could really, in some ways, it's like a TV show that way, where you really can go deep with kind of the lore and the characters and the backstory of it. Yeah,
I mean, I would say the major difference is honestly that with slasher movies, they might have some, we're going to get some backstory behind what happened to Jason and what happened, how Freddy Krueger became a dream demon or whatever. But that stuff is, while it's important to the film, it's not the film's primary reason for existing. And I think you could follow a Friday the 13th or a Nightmare on Elm Street movie on television if you were paying half attention. They kind of move between set pieces, There's a reason that the DVD releases of those respective franchises came with the sort of special edition DVD releases of those came with a function where you could literally jump to a kill on the DVD. You just hit a button and go directly to a kill, because that's sort of the reason those things exist entirely. I would argue that the Fear Street movies are more invested in the overarching story they're telling than they are in the supposed goods.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Although they do get kind of gory at times. There are some pretty gory kills in these things. Like, they're definitely R-rated movies aimed squarely at teenagers. But, that's kind of an institution that I have a certain fondness for. I believe we've talked about full moon features on the podcast before.
Oh, yeah. We should do an episode on full moon sometime. Just talking aloud. Yeah. I will say about the gore, I appreciated it. maybe I'm getting ahead of our conversation here, but I would say that I appreciated the gore in these films, which is pretty intense, and I know that the director of all three, Leigh Janiak, she fought for that gore. She said, these things need to be gory. We need to have that element. We need to have the graphic violence in it. So she fought for it. It still ended up feeling to me like I was watching a PG-13 movie that had some gory set pieces added to it. You know?
Yeah, there's something about the storytelling in these movies that does lean a little more young adult. And that's kind of... it's a genre thing that I always kind of have trouble articulating. It's something that you know when you see it, but it's a certain way that they like focus on a group, like the way that they frame a larger story around a group of teenagers, I guess would be the best way to put it.
Yeah, I mean, we should. I feel like we should mention. I mentioned in the intro up top, but obviously these films are loosely based on a series of novels by the American author R.L. Stein.
The extremely prolific.
Yes. Talk about a machine. I mean, that guy could kick him out, baby, like a novel a month, basically.
Truly.
Stein is best known, obviously, for the Goosebumps series. He wrote many of the Goosebumps, all of them really, in the 90s. That was his most popular series. Fear Street predates Goosebumps. It was his attempt to capture a slightly older audience, teenagers mostly. And the movies are loosely based on those books. They're not based on any particular... I mean... I couldn't say offhand how many books are in the Fear Street trilogy. I'm guessing at least a couple dozen. And,
yeah, there have to be a couple dozen Fear Street movies. And, this is kind of a genre of its own around this time, the late 80s, early 90s, the sort of teen horror thriller. And Christopher Pike was the other notable author of these types of books, and they really are a bridge between Goosebumps and kids horror and stuff like Stephen King. Yeah,
very much so. And even if they came before the Goosebumps books, I think a lot of readers probably found their way to Fear Street from Goosebumps, and then maybe to Stephen King or something from Fear Street. I personally kind of skipped that middle step. I read a couple of Fear Street books, but by the time I was moving on from Goosebumps, I was ready for just straight up adult horror fiction. I think I mostly went from Goosebumps to Stephen King, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I didn't really read any of these either, but the thing I remember most about these, and something that I think they did in a couple shots in the first film in Fear Street 1994, which we'll talk more about later, there's a couple shots in that movie that reminded me of the covers of these books, which I thought was pretty cool. They'd always have something like, like a skeleton in a cheerleader outfit driving a convertible or something like that. Yeah. It's the kind of imagery you see on the covers of these books. And I think, so I can't really speak to the mythology either, but the very broadest outlines are there are two towns, Sunnyvale and Shadyside, and Sunnyvale is the rich town where everything is perfect, and Shadyside's kind of the wrong side of the tracks. But in the context of the films, the reason that Shadyside's the wrong side of the tracks is because it was cursed by a witch who was hung in 1666, who every 15 years or so, once a generation, someone in Shadyside becomes possessed by a malignant force and becomes a serial killer, is basically the gist of it. And so the films, you have 1994, you have 1978, you have 1666, and these are obviously, touching on different generations of this phenomenon. And like you were saying, Dowd, they're kind of based around different styles of horror films, slasher films specifically. And slasher films are kind of a new thing for this director. Like you said, her name's Leigh Janiak, and she started off with a film called Honeymoon that came with Rose Leslie that came out in 2014. Now, I rather like that film. Did you see that one?
Oh, me too.
Yeah.
No, I did, definitely. And I thought that was a smart film. It's a smart film about marriage and about trying to figure out if maybe you married the wrong person. I think it sort of takes a body snatcher's metaphorical approach to that particular thematic ground, I would say. I thought it was creepy. I thought it showed a lot of promise.
Yeah, me too. From there, though, she seems to be taking, we'll see what she does after this, but she seems to be taking a path that honestly, I haven't seen a lot of women do this yet, which is that you start off with a really promising independent debut, and then you kind of get into a groove of making stuff with other people's IP, the kind of Colin Trevorrow career trajectory, because she was initially attached to that. She spent several years developing a script for a remake of The Craft, which ended up being directed by a different director. But she was attached to that for a while, and that's someone else's IP. And Fear Street is obviously based on the R.L. Stine series, like we were just talking about. And when she talks about these films, I was reading an interview with her that was in IndieWire, and she talks about it sort of similar to a director who works in, say, the MCU. She explicitly compares Fear Street to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I'll just read what she says. She says, "One of the exciting things about Fear Street is the fact that the universe is big and allows for a lot of space. One of the things I talked about before I was hired was the potential to create a Marvel Cinematic Universe, but for horror, where you have slasher killers from lots of different eras. You have the canon of our main mythology that's built around the fact that the devil lives in Shadyside, so there's also room for everything else." So she does kind of have a franchise ambitions for this particular trilogy, and, there are slasher characters, sort of over the centuries, these different maniacal killers that have appeared in Shadyside that they don't get their own films here. So you could have several more decades worth of Fear Street
definitely
films.
lays out the groundwork for if you wanted to give us the backstory of some of these other slashers, because the movie is frequently, particularly in the climax of these films, they'll kind of turn into these monster mash jamborees where a bunch of different slasher killers come out, and we're like, hey, what's the deal with that kid in the mask who's bashing people's heads in with a giant club? We don't find out. So I can sort of see that as these films as building a groundwork for a larger franchise if they were successful enough to inspire one.
Yeah. My personal favorite of the slasher villains, there's one that was supposed to be a murderer in 1965, where you have like a teenage girl with a big beehive and a mini skirt, and she carries around a razor blade and sings, like soul songs to herself. And I thought that was a pretty cool slasher villain.
I would watch that solo entry, I guess.
I would too. Well, that solo entry too, I think one of the big things that people talk about with these films is the needle drops. The 1965 version would be full of needle drops. This comes up most prominently in 1994, which has a soundtrack that includes tons and tons of 90s cornerstones. It opens with a Nine Inch Nails song. It's got Garbage, Bush, Portishead, Cypress Hill, Radiohead, White Zombie, Snoop Dogg, The Prodigy, Pixies, Soundgarden. It's wall-to-wall 90s hits. And what did you think about this aspect of these movies, Dowd?
I found it a little exhausting and a little silly, to be honest. I mean, I always find it a little silly when a movie set in a particular time period just bombards you with songs from that time period, because I think it is designed to sort of spark people's nostalgia sensors. But there are moments in this movie, like when we first go to Shadyside High, when our main characters are first shown at Shadyside High, there is a sequence that lasts, I would say, roughly 60 seconds, and there are 3 needle drops within that sequence.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
It's like somebody with an itchy finger on their Spotify or something. Or I guess in 1994 it would be somebody walking around with their Walkman on, and just constantly skipping to the next song or something.
Yeah, that
Sorry, they're Discmen.
Yeah, there's some grumbling online about how, say, like the Garbage song that's featured in 1994 didn't come out until 1995. And I think that, there is some merit to that argument in the sense that if you're trying to create a mood of a year, then the 90s definitely did have different phases to it. And some of the later songs they play are kind of from a later phase of the 90s. Like 94, you were still kind of in the end of the grunge era, You hadn't quite gotten to the electronic part of the 90s just yet. And so I think it does decrease the specificity, but far worse sin for me is using 3 needle drops in 30 seconds. Like, make up your mind. Make up your mind which one you want to do. Yeah, like...
Because, when somebody like Tarantino uses a needle drop,
it's very intentional.
It's very intentional, and he is fully aware of the effect he's trying to go for. This often feels like sonic wallpaper. Just throw a song here, and that will create the intended sense of when this is supposed to be set. And I don't. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that I don't really take it. Like, I wasn't so bent out of shape by the fact that some of these are anachronistic, especially if they're non-diegetic. Like, at one point, they use the Whitetown song "Your Woman," which came out in 1997, 3 years after this movie is set. But it's not, no character is playing that song. It's just on the soundtrack. That, to me, feels forgivable. Less forgivable, I think, is the fact that the movie leans really hard on these things and doesn't seem to be particularly discerning about how it uses them at all.
Yeah, that was the thing, is that I feel like a needle drop should be chosen intentionally to enhance the mood of a scene or to, you know, make subtext text or something like that. It should be very intentional in that way. And I felt that these were a little more arbitrarily chosen. And so I thought that was kind of disappointing, you know?
Yeah, it was just like, what's a song people will remember from the 90s? Just fucking throw it on the scene, you know? But, I mean, I felt that this one particularly felt anachronistic to me in a way that had less to do with the music and less to do with, say, what people were wearing, and more to do with just the kind of general vibe of these kids. And I feel like we could go down a real rabbit hole talking about this, but my general feeling about this whole trilogy is that the kids in these movies seem to me like Zoomers who are basically playing dress up as another generation's kids. You know?
I mean, that's the audience. That's the core audience for these films.
Yeah.
So I understand it in that way, but I do think that you're right. And I think that comes forward even more when you get to Fear Street 1978, because the behavior of teenagers between the late 70s and now is so radically different.
Yeah.
And when you've seen a lot of these classic golden age slasher movies, the kids are not nearly as considerate of each other as they are in these movies.
Right.
They're much meaner.
I found myself thinking that a lot of these kids seemed kind of excessively woke for the decade in which they're supposed to be occupying, you know? Particularly the 90s kids. All of them were like extremely progressive kids, and you can correct me if you think I'm wrong on this, but I think the likelihood of a small town in Ohio, of a teenager, of a teenage cheerleader in a small town in Ohio being openly gay, that feels like an anachronism to me.
Well, I mean, people were gay in 1994. I mean, I think I'm going to disagree with you a little bit there, because a key story... Okay, so if you haven't watched the movies, one of the core elements of the movie is you have your, like, a core trio of protagonists. And the main character is named Dina. And then you have her younger brother, Josh, who's obsessed with, like, serial killers and the town's lore. And he kind of serves as the one who explains what's going on to the rest of the characters and therefore the audience. But the other third main character in the film is Sam, who is Dina's kind of estranged girlfriend. And in the movie, there's a core conflict to where Dina wants to make their relationship public, but Sam doesn't. And Sam's afraid for them to be publicly together. And I think that is, you know, more of its era. It was riskier to be openly gay in 1994, especially, like you said, teenagers in a small town.
I see what you're saying, but I also think that the way that the other characters sort of respond to that is very laissez-faire in a way that felt very unfamiliar to me as somebody who grew up in the 90s. I was not a teenager in the 90s, but the rather rampant homophobia that ran through my Midwest school and town would suggest that some of these characters, I think, were I think the degree to which even the characters in their own friend group just sort of shrug it off. It felt to me. I mean, I could be way off base here. I could be. This could be something that happened all the time in the 90s. I think that the movie, well, the movie does acknowledge that the relationship is taboo in the sense that Sam's mother does not approve. Does not approve of it. I think the way that the other kids, I mean, sort of everybody knows they're a couple in the school, and that has not really made them. That has not really hurt their social capital in any way. That does not feel particularly true to my memories of the 90s anyway.
I mean, what hurts Sam's social capital more is that she transfers to the other school. She transfers to Sunnyvale.
Right, exactly. The fact that she goes from being in the kind of grungier other side of the town other side of the tracks town to the preppier to the preppier rich town, I think is really that's almost the core conflict between them.
Yes, it is. And I don't know. I mean, this didn't bother me in the sense that, like, I don't particularly want to see, like, vicious homophobia in a film like this. Yeah. I don't really see the need to, like, reenact it. I think, if anything, it would fit more into the 1978 chapter if they were going to treat that theme in these films. I mean, I was a teenager in the late 90s, and I knew people... There were people in my friend group who were gay, and everybody knew it, and nobody made a big deal out of it. But, I mean, that was, like, 5-6 years after this. So, I don't know.
Yeah. Maybe I'm wrong. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, honestly. It just, I think in general, these films, they feel like they are made from the vantage of right now, which is maybe inevitable if you're going to make these films from the vantage of right now. But they're so built around the notion of we're going to take you back to this previous decade that the general feeling, the sort of general anachronistic vibe of the performances and of other elements was distracting to me.
I think that the issue is less that it has a lesbian romance in it. I thought that was kind of cool. Like, you know, it's something that you never would have seen in one of these movies, you know, in the day. And it's kind of cool to update it in that way. You know, it does bring it more into the modern era, and it gives kids watching it today something to hang on to that they didn't have in the older movies. And I think that's kind of cool. I don't really have a problem with that at all. But I do agree that the performances and the dialogue and the story were not especially true to the time periods that they're aping, and the films in those time periods. I think the part of this whole trilogy that feels the most like the movies it's paying tribute to is the first 5 minutes or so of Fear Street 1994, which is a clear homage to Scream, where they kill off...
Yeah.
Yes, a direct homage where they kill off the most famous actor in the film in a very tense slasher scene in the first 5 minutes, a la Drew Barrymore in Scream.
Not just the most famous actor in the film, a young up-and-coming starlet who got her start as a child actor and who was part of a famous acting family.
That's true. It does go pretty deep, doesn't it?
It does. Yeah, I mean, it's very deliberate. And actually, honestly, that moment was the moment where I was most like, okay, these might actually be kind of interesting or at least fun. I mean, literally, like, Janiak is like borrowing direct shots and moments from Scream in that opening sequence. Scream, though, is a really high bar to clear. So I think that this film does not necessarily do itself a ton of favors by immediately evoking Scream, because this is a film that lacks many of the qualities that make Scream so special, I think.
Yeah, it doesn't. Scream has the ability to, it really has that show-stopping first sequence, but all of the other kills in Scream ramp up the tension also. And I felt like Fear Street 1994 never quite got up to the level of tension that it achieved in those first 5 minutes.
Agreed. I think beyond that, I just think that the set pieces just aren't as strong as the ones in Scream. I think that the kids don't have as much personality. I think part of that is this extreme politeness about them, you know? I sort of described this after I watched it, which is that this is Scream for the book smart generation, which is really how it feels to me in a lot of ways. But
I mean, listen, enough movies have come out where the kids act this way that maybe our old selves just have to, you know, accept that this is how Gen Z is. maybe this is how kids today are, and I'm being a very old man in commenting on that. We're relics from a meaner time.
Yeah, exactly. Because the kids in this are very nice. I also think that they kind of are lacking in personality, to be honest. I don't think that these are particularly well-developed characters. They're not funny like the characters in Scream were necessarily. And I don't think this thing has as strong of a handle on its own act of homaging and its own act of sort of genre revisionism as Scream does. Scream is a very, I think, shrewd film about what it's riffing on, and this to me feels like, for one thing, it's sort of a riff on a riff in the sense that it's doing Scream, but beyond that, I feel like its points of reference are not as sharp as Scream's. You know, I mean, you have the kind of Randy character in this, and he brings up Jaws, and he brings up Poltergeist or something. And that's sort of where the film's awareness of other horror movies ends, you know?
I mean, yeah, you know, that's an interesting point that it is kind of a riff on a riff, because Scream itself was riffing on, you know, like classic era slasher films.
Yeah, everything is old. Everything that's old will be new again, you know? And in the same way that Scream was reviving the slasher movies of the 80s and repackaging them for a new audience, for a younger audience, this is sort of looking back to Scream and saying, and doing the same thing for that, and saying, we're taking this thing that now is ancient in the eyes of our target audience, and we're giving it this new sheen and repackaging it for you.
Yeah, I kind of disagree about there not being any personality to the characters. I think that's kind of a hallmark of slasher movies, is that a lot of the characters are pretty interchangeable. So I think that's just par for the course in a movie like this. And I actually liked the character of Josh, the little brother. I found that actor, I found him kind of endearing. But what's interesting, talking about riffs on riffs, is I think that the opening sequence is Scream, right? But a lot of the rest of the film is more like Stranger Things than anything, which is also a riff.
It's interesting. I think it's worth talking about the origins of this franchise as well, because these movies, they feel so much like Netflix attempting to make something that's really going to feed the algorithm, and that's really going to appeal to people who liked Stranger Things. But the fact of the matter remains that these movies did not begin as Netflix projects. They were developed for 20th Century Fox, and then Netflix ended up buying them. And I still, that's remarkable to me, because they do really feel like Netflix said, let's do something that's sort of like Stranger Things. And we'll get another hit of that vein, because I mean, it comes down to even like the way that the film is lit, in the sort of look of this small town, which is very, even though it's set in the 90s, it's often bathed. It's like they use these color gels that make it give it kind of the neon glow of the 1980s. And it definitely, I mean, this thing does feel like it is designed to strike people's nostalgia centers in the same way that Stranger Things is.
I would love to know then what the original, pitch was for the films when they were at Fox, and if the storyline changed significantly when they moved it over to Netflix, because in a lot of ways, this thing is structured more like a miniseries than it is as a trilogy of films.
It is, and that's the thing. But I think the thing is, I think that Netflix bought them fully made. And I think that these things it's really hard to believe, because these things really do feel like they're designed to be watched the way that they were released, which is one a week. You can almost binge these things if you wanted to. They're very episodic in a way. I can't imagine, you know, I mean, I can't imagine seeing one of these things and then going, oh, I can't wait to see the next one in 6 months or a year or something. Which is the way they would presumably be released through a traditional theatrical model. Because they really do feel like, hey, press play on the next entry, you know, or we'll see you next week, the way that obviously a TV show, people engage with a TV show.
It's very see you next week, and every single one of the films, and well, the first two films, not the third one, and with a trailer for the next installment, which is like, it is very like next time on Fear Street. It's got that kind of quality to it, and it opens with a recap, and it does feel very episodic to me. And the last one, 1666, it's 2 hours long. Only the first hour is 1666. The second hour is 1994 Part 2, and that feels like 2 TV episodes split up to me.
It does. It's like a 2-part TV episode for sure. Yeah. I mean, I think this whole I think you're hitting on that. This whole trilogy feels like television in a lot of respects, and I think it feels like TV in the storytelling. I think it feels like TV in the expectation of how people are going to consume this, and I think it sometimes feels like TV in the way that they're shot too, unfortunately. But
and what do you think, that one film was more like that than the others?
Well, not necessarily, but I think that I would say that 1666 is the one that feels the most like a TV episode to me, because it feels like one of those old sitcom episodes where somebody gets clonked on the head or something, and they wake up and they're like in another time period, and suddenly all their friends are dressed. Yeah, I mean, it's basically like Wishbone or something. I mean, they like.
R-rated Wishbone.
Yeah. Or, I mean, I said this in the review, but it's sort of Back to the Future 3 as well. It's like, it basically is like, we're going to take these same characters and just throw them into older times, we'll say, and we're going to kind of dress them up. And there's something just about I remember a lot of people like sort of mentioning the witch when they first saw the trailer for this. And this has none of 1666 has none of the verisimilitude of the witch, of language or environment. It has none of the sense that, it is none of the atmosphere of the witch. It does not. It honestly, to me, feels like a TV show set with the same characters set during that time period, and some of that 100%. Could be. Yeah, I mean, some of that could be budgetary limitations. Maybe spend less of your budget on those expensive, clearing those expensive songs you want to use, and more of it on creating a more believable and evocative sense of place.
But, I mean, at the same time, though, if this thing is intended to be a YA story, structured like a TV series, it's got young actors in it. Like we said, the storytelling is not especially reminiscent of the periods that it's aping. Maybe they didn't want it to be, quite like The Witch. Maybe it is supposed to be more of that soap opera, very special episode kind of quality to it. Because the last film, it does function mostly. I was mostly interested in it as a way of wrapping up the story. And the last one is full of, in 1994, 1978, the first two films, you see different flashes of the witch, who was hung and has caused the curse on this town and is the reason we're jumping through time the way we are. And you see those scenes play out in the third one where you're like, that's where she lost her hand. Okay. Something you only saw a brief glimpse of in the first movie. You see it actually play out in the third. And, I was interested in it on that level. But other than that, I'm not sure that it was intended to be like The Witch. I think they would have tried a little bit harder on the period atmosphere if that's what they were actually going for. I think maybe that's just like the most obvious reference point for a colonial horror movie.
You're probably right. I mean, this is not attempting to be some sort of groany A24 mood piece or something.
Yeah, it's not an elevated horror series. Right. This is like pulpy teen horror. It's not elevated.
Unabashedly. Yeah, unabashedly for a teen audience. And there's nothing wrong with that, and I'll freely admit that I was not necessarily the target audience for this, even though I think this thing is also designed to get somebody who might be roughly my age nostalgic for both the time period of the 90s, but also some of the things that you and I may have watched when we were that age as well.
I thought it was fully for people who were not alive then.
It probably works best for that audience, I'd say.
Probably.
I think it's interesting to look at a book series that was big in the 90s and to say we're going to make this into something for an audience that will have no memory of that series. So my guess would be that it was hoping to kind of hit both of those demographics. That it was hoping that today's kids would like it, but also that somebody who grew up reading the Fear Street books might also want to watch it as well. You're right, though, that it certainly plays... It certainly is often very directly playing more to a younger audience.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look at the second film, Fear Street, 1978, it's got Carry On My Wayward Son plays in it like 2 or 3 times. It's not quite as heavy on the needle drops, but there are quite a few needle drops in it. But that being said, I don't think that anyone who was a teenager, I don't think that movie is aimed at anyone who was a teenager in the 70s. Like I said, really the only period accurate things in it are the setting and the costumes and the songs. There's really nothing about it that's like a 80s slasher movie. So I didn't really think that one was made with, an audience like Gen Xers or I suppose even baby boomers in mind at all. I think that was fully made for teenagers.
It's superficially modeled on 80s slashers. I think it definitely, we're meant to look at it and think, at least for a moment, about summer camp horror movies from the early 80s, Friday the 13th and its various imitators. But the film does not resemble those movies really at all. I mean, I think in a lot of respects, its pacing is completely different. It takes a good 40 minutes for somebody to be killed in the film.
There's way more plot.
There's way more plot. The slasher movies of the 80s were often very, again, we sort of mentioned this earlier, but were very built around their set pieces. And in this, I feel like the actual kills that happen in 1978 are very swift, sometimes even off camera. The movie does not make a meal out of its set pieces, even though the gore is kind of heavy in some spots. We don't get that long sequence that you get in a lot of slasher movies where a character is sort of fleeing from the killer and being chased, and there's a long suspenseful...
That's true. There isn't really one of those in there, is it?
They don't really do that.
That's such a cornerstone of the genre. I mean, you have kids having sex. You have kids playing pranks on each other. Those are superficial 70s, 80s slasher movie qualities that the film has.
I mean, but that stuff felt like it had quotation marks around it to me, It was like, this is the moment where we have sex, air quotes, It almost felt like the kids themselves were aware that that's what they were supposed to, like the characters were aware of the role they were supposed to be playing there, and they were just like, guess we have to do drugs now. Hey, winking at each other,
let's do drugs so we can die. Well, okay, so that's interesting. We were talking about, how the first one's kind of a riff on a riff because it's riffing on Scream. A riff on a riff here, to me, would be it's Wet Hot American Summer more than it is
I didn't even think about that. That's true.
It's more that than Summer Camp Massacre.
You're right. It's like a second-hand version of... or almost a third-hand version, because it almost feels more informed by something like Wet Hot than by the original films,
Yeah. I think that's kind of what I'm thinking, talking about these films in detail, is that a lot of them are riffs on riffs. They are third-hand references, a lot of them.
It's like a game of telephone or something. It's almost like you're like, these are not based on the direct source; they're based on something that was already based on that source or something. It's like they're getting their information about what these films were like several steps removed.
Yeah, absolutely, and excuse me, and when I see like Gen Z kids or kids that are in high school now, when I see them wearing 90s fashions, I think to myself, but we thought of that as a 70s fashion in the 90s. So maybe that's just a kind of, and maybe that's a core part of the Gen Z experience, is that all your references are third hand by this point. The snake eats its own tail.
That's really interesting that these might be reflecting that. Yeah, I get that, yeah. Although there are moments also where, like, a character in this movie says the word shagadelic. Now, I think Austin Powers might have made shagadelic up. Like, if you Google it, like, the first few results you get is Austin Powers. And I think one of them even says, it is highly believed that the Austin Powers films made up this word. Now, somebody with a little institutional memory should come in and correct me if people were actually saying shagadelic in 1978. But that to me feels like, this is something kids said back then, right?
No, totally. And I think that the hippies in 1978 are a really great example of this idea of that they're not really based on hippies. They're based on parodies of hippies that you would see in comedies throughout the 80s and 90s.
Totally. Yeah, a lot of these movies just felt to me like playing like cosplaying another decade in a lot of respects.
Yeah. And you know what? Like, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And as a whole, like, as far as the storytelling and it being kind of anachronistic goes, something that I appreciated that this series is kind of girl-centric, and it doesn't, it has those core main characters, Sam and Dina, and I appreciate that aspect of it. And there is, in 1666, as functional as it is, does kind of have a simplistic for teenage level, but it kind of has some commentary on it about how the ways that powerful men will scapegoat rebellious women as a way of covering up their own crimes. And I think as kind of a mess, as far as a horror movie for teens goes, I thought that was kind of an interesting element to put in there. One that, again, you wouldn't have seen in an earlier version of one of these movies, but I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I'm happy to see it added in there.
No, I mean, you're actually kind of hitting on something that that I think is sort of charming about these films, which on a whole I did not much care for, to be honest. But I think, for one thing, I do think that the third entry kind of brings this in for a strong landing, not necessarily as an individual film. I think as an individual film, it has as many problems as the other two have. And I think that I can't even imagine trying to watch this thing isolated from the other two. It would just be pure nonsense. It would
make no sense.
It would have no value to you, honestly. I mean, it really, I think it only really works as an end to this saga. But as an end to this saga, I think it works, and I think part of that is the way that it subverts certain expectations that the audience might have. I think it subverts certain ideas about the legacy that this town has, and I think that you were kind of hinting at this earlier, or talking about it a little bit, and I do think these movies are kind of charming as a reclamation of the slasher for a different audience, and I don't just mean a Gen Z audience. I also mean for a queer audience, you know, and. I think that the decision to focus on two women who are in love, two young girls who are in love, I think does kind of reclaim a genre that has been traditionally very heterosexual, and it does kind of reclaim them for that audience, to the point where even if there are elements of it that feel anachronistic in terms of how these characters are received by their peers, that maybe is forgivable in the sense if you sort of look at what these movies are trying to be and what audience they're trying to serve.
Also, I thought it was kind of funny that the hanging tree from colonial times ended up in the food court at the mall.
It's a fun idea. Yeah. Yeah. I think the way that they resolve the Sarah Fear storyline, and the films obviously are all about this. There's this rich history that all the films refer to, going back to the 1600s, where the last film is partially set. And there's sort of these assumptions about what happened back then, and they've been built into the town lore. And I think the way that the film subverts that is actually kind of smart and kind of clever. And I think there is a political idea behind that I think is pretty good, especially for a movie targeted mostly at teenagers. Okay, Katie, so would you recommend the Fear Street movies to someone?
Well, I would wholeheartedly recommend them to teenage girls, particularly ones who are interested in horror. I'm really excited and invigorated about the idea of a gory slasher trilogy that's aimed squarely at them. Yeah. Overall, I would recommend at least the first one. I would recommend 1994 overall. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I can agree with that idea. I mean, I reviewed these films for the site. I gave every last one of them a C+. I don't think as individual films they're really all that successful, but I also do have to acknowledge on some level that they just might not be for me. And I found myself focusing a lot on the ways in which they were not successfully evoking the films that they're kind of riffing on. I was like,
and they don't always, but yeah. I think that what we're talking about today is that they're a riff on a riff, maybe, you know,
right?
Like we were saying,
right. So just the fact that they don't recreate exactly what they're riffing on, or what they're secondhand riffing on, I guess, is not necessarily totally damning, especially for an audience that might not give a shit if this thing reminds them of, of My Bloody Valentine or something, the band or the movie. So I think that you're right, that these things could really work for a particular audience, a younger audience. And my hope would be that if they watch them, and maybe they could serve as a kind of gateway drug to better horror movies.
Yes, I think that in the end, that might be the most valuable thing that these films have to offer. The Fear Street Trilogy is available to stream on Netflix now. Please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to Film Club wherever you get your podcasts.
This week's episode of Film Club was hosted by me, Alex Dowd, and by Katie Rife. It was edited and mixed by Zach Goldsboro, and our motion graphics designer was Julie Mullins. Thanks, folks.
Bye.